Okay, welcome. Now this is we're going to cover section 10 on the FAR bar as is 5 contract. This is section 10. It's kind of covered up here. You won't be able to see it, but because I have some notes there, but this is section 10. It basically is some disclosures that we need to discuss. There are several of them. I think it goes A through, I don't know, maybe H or I or something like that. So we'll just go through them. Rate on gas, there's a disclosure that remember the contract is between the buyer and the seller, and this is what we're making sure that all parties are aware. And by the way, just I think I've mentioned this in other sections, but your clients need to be fully um, aware. Your job is not to explain this contract to them. They're the ones that are signing it. So once you have a seller, if you take a listing, I would encourage you to hand this contract to the seller and say, hey, look, here's the contract that we'll probably be using when we get an offer, so you need to be familiar with it. If you have any questions, we'll talk about it. And if you have any real questions, you can seek legal counsel. Same thing with the buyer. When you start working with the buyer, here's a contract when we make an offer, here's what we're going to be using. So make sure you're familiar. We can discuss some things, and then they'll give you some time to get some legal counsel if you really want to go after it and do that. So with that in mind, here are the disclosures we're making to the parties of the contract. Rate on gas, rate on a naturally occurring gas that is accumulated in a building. They have basically just saying that they have the right to have an inspection for that, and you can always get more information from your county health department. So that's what they're noting there. Permits disclosure. This has changed a little bit from the last contract, so I'm just going to read it carefully. So except as may have been disclosed by the seller or buyer in a written disclosure. So other than what we've already disclosed, let's say the seller has made buyers aware of certain things. Seller does not know of any improvements made to the property which were made without the required permits or pursuant to permits which have not been properly closed. So if the seller knows of these things, they need to disclose that in the seller's disclosure, which we're going to cover later. All right. It says other than those that we've already disclosed, there's nothing else that we're aware of. If seller identifies permits which have not been properly closed or improvements which were not permitted, then the seller shall promptly deliver to buyer all the plans, written documentation, or other information in the seller's possession, knowledge, or control relating to the improvements of the property, which are subject to of such open permits or unpermitted improvements. So if the buyer discovers that there is unpermitted work done, and by the way, you need to start having these inspections done and doing these municipal lien searches and open permit searches. All that needs to be done during the inspection period, which is anywhere just from 10 to 15 days. All right, when we have to have that done right away. But if the buyer discovers it, the seller, notice here, is not obligated to cure it or fix it. All right, it doesn't say anything about that. It just says that the buyer can still back out. And if the buyer wants to try and get them closed out, then the seller is basically agreeing to provide any documentation they have that may assist in that. So just make sure you're aware of that. Okay. Part C, mold. Mold is naturally occurring and may cause health risks or damage to property. If buyer is concerned or desires additional information regarding mold, buyer should contact an appropriate professional. Now, up here I had a little, listen to the audio regarding mold, because here's the thing. There's a mold disclosure that we have. It's part of the seller's disclosure. That's why we recommend we use the FAR bar seller's disclosure. It's part of it. If the seller, are you aware of any mold? Okay. Generally, then there's a mold inspection addendum. What we suggest you do is that if you have a regular inspection, all right, and you have a certain time period, let's say 10 days to do the regular inspection, home inspection of all sorts, that you give yourself at least an additional 5 days, so in this case 15, to have your mold inspection. Because what will normally happen is this, the way it transpires is that the buyer will have a regular home inspection, and the home inspector will be going through doing all his things, and one of the things he'll note is, hey, look, I saw some stuff that may or may not be mold. I'm not a mold professional, or a mold inspection takes a little bit more time. So you want to, if that was being done on the 9th or 10th day, you want to have some time that you can extend that, or have that extra days to get a mold inspection done if the regular inspector suggests that you have a mold inspection. Hope that makes sense. So you want to give yourself a little more time than the regular inspection time to actually have the mold inspection in the event that the first inspection brings up things that may be of a concern. All right. D, flood zone. it's the buyer's responsibility to verify by elevation certificate which flood zone the property is in. All right. I highly suggest if you read through this whole thing, and you can read through it carefully, all right, that um, the buyer may terminate the contract if they discover that if it's below the minimum flood elevation or isn't eligible for flood insurance. All right, the buyer can cancel the contract by delivering written notice to seller within 20 days after the effective date. Right, so but that means you've got to know that that's there, and make that determination, get the survey and the uh, elevation certificate done in a timely enough manner so that you can therefore uh, have time to cancel. So you want to give yourself enough time to cancel if the buyer can't get the inspection or can't get the insurance based upon the elevation. All right, you can read through all this. Don't become a flood. Well, you can become a flood expert, but rely on the insurance professionals to do that. Let them help do those things. Energy brochure just says buyer acknowledges receipt of the Florida Energy Rating Information Brochure, which is available on. It's a matter of public record about determining energy efficiency. Lead-based paint. If the property includes pre-1978 residential housing, a lead-based paint disclosure is mandatory. We all know that if it's built prior to 78, regardless if it's been repainted several times or whatever the case may be, a lead-based paint addendum will need to be created, which we can cover later. Homeowners Association, buyer should not execute this contract until buyer has received and read the Homeowners Association community disclosure, if applicable. Get this question a lot. Sometimes people will ask, well, should my buyer do it? We've included, there wasn't one included. If you know there's an HOA, Homeowners Association, or if you know there's a homeowners association, then you need to have that filled out by the seller prior to your buyer signing it, because what you want to, and you certainly don't want to send over a blank HOA disclosure that's been signed by your buyer and say, please fill this out. You may send over a blank one, say, hey, look, I didn't notice one was here. I need this filled out, so that once it's filled out, then I'll have my buyer sign it so that they're being made aware of everything that's involved. Property tax disclosure summary. Buyer should not rely on the seller's current property taxes, the amount of property taxes that the buyer may be obligated to pay in the years subsequent after to purchase. A change of ownership or property improvements triggers reassessments, and that could result in higher property taxes. If you have any questions concerning valuation, can talk to county. By the way, reiterate one more time. Do not let them hear this from you. You send them to the county. Hey, you guys can go check this out on your own. You can determine whether or not you can have them give you an estimate. Here's what we're thinking about paying for this property. What would my taxes be next year based upon that? All right. So all important things. Just realize that you can use that as a guide, current year's taxes, but maybe the current person does or does not have homestead exemption, and your buyer would or would not. So you want to make sure that you're aware that, and the buyer, more importantly, is aware that that may change. I is Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act, FIRPTA. My note here is just do not become, you are not a FIRPTA expert. FIRPTA is a foreign investors tax for foreigners that have invested in real property here in the United States. It's a tax issue. It needs to be handled by an accountant or a CPA, somebody that's familiar with it. All your parties need later on, because it's going to see standard V. It notes here, see standard V for further information. When we go through the standards, we're going to discuss these things a little bit. But you in no way want to become an expert in this. You just want to refer people to the right people to get their information regarding it. Now, you say, hey, I'm only a buyer. I don't need to worry about it. Yeah, you do, because when we read standard V, all right, if the seller does not do what they properly need to do and enough money is held back at closing based upon this FIRPTA, if they truly are a foreign investor, then the buyer could be held liable for it. All right, so you want to make sure that that's all done properly, and we'll read about that later in the standards. And then finally, the seller's disclosure, J. I said, again, my notes up here say listen to about FIRPTA and also the seller's disclosure. Here's the deal on J with a seller's disclosure. All a seller's disclosure is a chance for the sellers to let us know what they know about a property. Okay. Seller knows of no facts materially affecting the value of the real property which are not readily observable, which have not been disclosed to the buyer. All right. So a actual seller's disclosure statement that we have is a chance for the seller to come clean. This statement says that other than what's on the seller's disclosure, we don't know of anything and we're not hiding anything. Except as provided for in the preceding sentence, seller extends and intends no warranty and makes no representations of any type, either express or implied, as the physical condition of the history of the property. That means is this: hey, look, I can't tell you how things are going to go in the future, and I make no warranty. However, if I know of things that materially affect the value, like the roof leaks or the AC was patched up yesterday, or there was a sinkhole in the middle of the living room 3 weeks ago, all those things need negatively affect or materially affect the value of the property, and they need to be disclosed. Except as otherwise disclosed in writing, seller has received no written or oral uh, or verbal and notice from any governmental entity or agency to a currently uncorrected building, environmental, or safety code violation. So this is the seller cannot. This is not a caveat emptor. This is not the buyer beware situation. This is saying that if a seller knows of something, they have to disclose it. All right. Now, where do they disclose it? On the seller's disclosure, which we'll talk about later. Real quick word on seller's disclosures. It's become very chic right now to have investors and or people that have never lived in the property say seller has never lived in the property, and that's all they're going to do. Well, they need to be aware that that does not absolve them. There are properties, I use this illustration a lot. There are properties that I own as rental properties that I've never lived in, but I know a lot about. There are properties that I know that I flipped, even though I've never lived there. I know a lot about what's gone on. So if there's anything I know, I have to disclose. All I can disclose is to what's to the best of my knowledge. So we always require people, even if a seller refuses it and we represent the buyer, we make the buyer sign a seller disclosure saying the seller refused to complete this. If we have a seller that says, I've never lived in the property, all right, then you have to say, all right, you've never lived in the property. You're going to write that on each page of the seller's disclosure, but I just need to make you aware that that does not absolve you from your disclosure requirement. If you know of anything, you need to let them know about it because you're obligated by law to do so. So that's section 10, which covers all of these different disclosures and cover some different things. Once again, do not become the interpreter of this contract necessarily for your clients. You just tell them, you can talk knowledge, you can have some knowledge when you talk to about it, but you don't need to be the interpreter. They can seek out any of the information. Give them plenty of time to review it, and if they need to go seek legal counsel to get information directly on what they reflect or decide is a interpretation of that, then they can do so. All right. Hope that helps on section 10. Have a great night.